The Shaping of Gondor, Part 3, The Line of Eärnil. Chapter 3, Atanatar Alcarin. Since the death of Siriondil in 830, 4 kings had sat the White Throne: Taranon, Eärnil, Kiriandil, and Hjarmindikil. Each had built upon the successes of their predecessors to increase the power and glory of Gondor and her empire, and each had handed to his successor a realm larger and mightier than that which they had themselves inherited. Indeed, because all 4 built up Gondor's navies, they are, they are together sometimes known as the Ship Kings, or the Noontide Kings. With the death of Hjarmindikil, however, this long run of royal excellence came to an end, for the prince who succeeded the South Victor on the throne of Gondor in 1149 was no warrior. The prince, now king as Atanatar II, could scarcely have been less like his father. Where Hjarmindikil delighted in action, motion, and accomplishment, Atanatar favored idleness and sloth. Where the father preferred simplicity and almost ascetic modesty, the son adored luxury and extravagance. Where the one shunned frivolity, wine, and sport, the other reveled in them. It almost begged the question of the legitimacy of the prince's parentage. Actually, the most likely culprit behind the difference in the characters of father and son was simple overindulgence. Preoccupied with his conquests, his building projects, and his innumerable royal duties, Hjarmindikil presumably gave little thought to the tutelage of his son and heir in the royal ways, instead turning that responsibility over to tutors, chaperones, and courtiers. This unfortunately almost always ends in royal heirs becoming spoiled, for they encounter far too much flattery and privilege to develop the toughness and wisdom which hard experience in the saddle might otherwise provide. It had happened with Anardil, and with Siriondil, and now it was to happen again. All appeared well at first, to be sure. Atanatar, physically anyway, was every inch a king. Tall and handsome, with flowing auburn hair that matched twinkling chestnut eyes, he was as comely as Hjarmindikil had been forbidding in appearance, and the royal court in Osgiliath was merrier than it had been under his dour, duty-ridden predecessor. In fact, during recent centuries up to this time, Osgiliath had suffered something of a social eclipse. Siriondil had held court in Ethelond. Taranon Falister had preferred to live in Pelargir, as had Eärnil the Seafarer. Kiriandil, as we have seen, was obliged to spend most of his reign in the south, in and around Umbar, but on the rare occasions that he was at home, he too had preferred Pelargir as his seat. Hjarmindikil spent practically the whole of his rule on the move, either on campaign or touring the provinces, only rarely entering the capital. So the last king of Gondor who had made his permanent residence in Osgiliath had been Atanatar the Proud, over 4 centuries earlier. This new king Atanatar, however, put an end to all that. He had been with his father at his deathbed in Dunland in early 1149. After negotiating a hasty truce with the Dunlendings, he hurried back south, and at his command, the citadel of the stars shone with light and brilliance once again. The wine flowed, the feasts were served, the harps sang, and the fountains pattered cheerily. The new king spared no expense from the royal purse, for he was determined to make Osgiliath a capital befitting the greatest kingdom of men in the world. Indeed, because of the grandiose adornments he left behind, as well as his opulent mode of life, he was to become known as Atanatar Alcarin, that is, Atanatar the Glorious. The building of a broad new bridge straddling the Anduin was begun. Numerous mansions, palaces, and pleasure houses sprang up almost like trees to line the majestic white avenues. Lavish shrines and temples to the Valar were raised. A grand amphitheater was constructed for the purpose of horse and chariot racing, for the amusement of the court and the populace. But greatest of all, completed in 1175, was the Dome of Stars, a truly magnificent vaulting edifice at the center of the royal palace, which rose 500 feet and was inlaid with deep blue lapis and encrusted with diamonds and crystals. Eventually, an equally breathtaking banqueting chamber known as the Hall of 1,000 Fountains was raised as well. Small wonder that it became a common saying among those who visited Gondor from elsewhere in Middle-earth during these years, that gold was as common as dirt, and that her children played with precious stones in the streets as if they were pebbles. At these exaggerations we can scoff, but there can be no doubt of the extraordinary amount of wealth and plenty encountered by those who walked the streets and avenues of the Gondorian cities under the scepter of Atanatar Alcarin. Naturally, poets, mummers, and minstrels flocked to the capital, eager to compete for the patronage of the king and nobility, and Atanatar welcomed them all. Some, such as Dinon of Dimbar and Vardamir the Bright, became notoriously wealthy and renowned throughout the kingdom for the lays and ballades they offered before the court. The scribes and the libraries also flourished, though less fulsomely, as the king had small interest in learning, history, or philosophy. Along with this admittedly dazzling flower of culture, and the arts, of course, came also a spawning of the squalor and depravity that accompanies any great concentration of wealth. The brothels multiplied, as did the gambling houses and the taverns. Tinkers, mountebanks, courtesans, and indigents began to infest the streets, in contrast to the finery of the more privileged classes of Gondorian society. King Atanatar himself often joined in on the parade of debauchery. He was thrice married, and sired at least 20 bastards, in addition to his legitimate heirs. Glorious in spending and enjoying the privileges of kingship, Atanatar may well have been. His manner of attending to the actual business of ruling was far less so. Preferring not to be bothered overmuch by the demands of state, the king merely went through the motions of ceremony. He received emissaries, rubber-stamped memoranda, presided over the rituals of the temples, delegating and deferring whenever possible to various ministers and stewards. Rarely during his reign did he venture outside the royal ward, or, as time wore on, even outside of the capital itself. More and more, as Atanatar grew older, he withdrew into his private world of pleasure, and the ship of government was given over to other, more concerned hands. In 1176, for instance, when the wildling tribes east of the Sea of Rhun launched a lukewarm assault on Dorwinion and Rovanion, it was not the king, but one of his father's aged generals, Archirias, who led the counterattack. Atanatar ended the affair by agreeing to pay an indemnity to the barbarians, a disgrace in the eyes of many of his captains. Likewise, when Umbar made an attempt at rebellion in 1198, it was the king's brother, Aramendiel, who put the mutineers down, and butchered a quarter of the city's population into the bargain. About the only really meaningful accomplishment that can be ascribed to Atanatar's reign is the inception of a new law code. The Code of Inzelthon, which had served as the supreme governing instrument since the days of Isildur and Anarion, had become grievously outdated, and at the king's behest a revised code was assembled and promulgated in 1180. By the terms of this epistle, there was a significant relaxing of standards, particularly in the social constraints of the realm. Those of Numenorean descent could now wed outside of the blood, with the exception of those belonging to the royal house of Anarion, for example. Penalties were made more severe for the mistreatment of slaves and serfs. Other new provisions included direct taxation of the merchants and peasantry, and the delegation of more authority to the provincial councils and courts. For the remainder of Gondorian history, this Alcarin code was to hold sway, largely unchanged down to the present year. Atanatar II died in 1226, after a reign of 77 feckless years, during which time he had luxuriated in the achievements of his predecessors, while accomplishing almost nothing whatever of worth himself. Yet he was most popular during his own lifetime, particularly among the nobility and common folk, both of whom relished the relief he brought them from the heavy taxes and duties of his father, Hjarmindakil. Only with the men of the armies and navies did the king's lustre wear thin, as they alone were starved of funds. It was not that Atanatar was entirely bereft of admirable qualities. He raised numerous grand monuments, and the many artists he patronized created many lovely verses, stories, songs, and paintings for future generations of Gondorians to revel in, and he left the cities of the realm undeniably more beautiful. Nevertheless, the fact cannot be ignored that the seeds of many of the hardships that were soon to descend upon the Seven Heartlands were sown during his rule. His reckless spending, his neglect of the ministries of government, his abandonment of diplomacy, and above all, his lack of maintenance of Gondor's armies, would all return to plague the kingdom soon enough. As with the kings of the spring of Gondor before him, he got away with his excesses in his own lifetime, leaving his successors to reap the consequences.